some point, people are not, I mean, there's a legally, there's somebody can be adjudicated as incompetent, but people have varying levels of cognitive impairment, and they can make decisions on some things and not other things. So it's very difficult, when there are people, most people, a lot of people that I work with have guardians, and having to support guardians or people who, to make decisions, especially if somebody is very medically fragile. And that it's like it's a really difficult thing, because in one case, what's the value of life? With somebody who does have an intellectual disability or a lifelong medical fragility, do we say these people's life doesn't have value? And then how do you make decisions? Because lots of times I find that people will be in situations just based on their medical problems that they're always teetering on life and death decisions. And it's hard. How do you make these kinds of decisions, or how do you guide people? I was thinking about some of the things, some of the ideas that or the notions that you were talking about in terms of making some or guiding people.
Well, I mean, I really appreciate the question, and I think the thing to acknowledge up front is that in most states, hospice does not serve people with intellectual disabilities well. And it's not out of a lack of desire to care for folks like that. It's out of, in my experience, two variables that really work against folks like that getting good hospice care. So one of the variables is simply the unintentional barriers created by state laws that have been set up to protect people with intellectual disabilities. Because we have such a terrible history, right, of warehousing folks like this, of withholding care that they would have benefited from, of keeping them out of pieces of society in which they would have flourished and to which they would have contributed. Most laws now err on the side of protecting and saying, in other words, that what we mean by protect is giving all care possible. So we are hesitant to not offer an intervention for fear that we're not offering it out of some kind of stigma or discrimination against a person with this kind of disability. And in some areas of life, that equating protection with treatment works very well and achieves the goal of protecting. It ensures that people with very treatable infections get early treatment, for example. It ensures that to the extent that they can be living in the community, that they now do live in the community. It ensures that to the extent that they can participate in educational activities in schools with people who don't have disabilities, they now participate in those activities. Towards the end of life, though, those ways of defining protection by linking it with amount of treatment, they backfire in the same way that that kind of thinking backfires for anyone, regardless of their kind of disability, which is that at the end of life, actually, higher quality treatment tends to mean less quantity of treatment. So it can end up being very hard legally to admit someone to hospice care at the end of life, because often admitting someone to hospice care means then getting the guardian engaged in developing a plan of care, and developing a plan of care usually means saying no, say, to the 6th line of chemotherapy, or having a plan to not resuscitate because resuscitation won't work. And every time guardians make choices to say no to a care intervention, they run up against legal barriers to doing that. I think the other reason that hospice has not had a history, at least nationally, of serving people with intellectual disabilities well, is that hospice doesn't have much experience doing that. In the same way that hospice doesn't have much experience caring for people who don't have families at home who are able to be their primary caregivers. Hospice was set up thinking that people were going to be clear-headed, had very clear visions of how they wanted to die. They were going to be living at home, and they were going to have family members available to take care of them. So if you don't have family members available to take care of you, or you don't have clear wishes now and have never had clear wishes because you've been impaired for most of your life, then the hospice model of care, it can still work, but it has to be rearranged. And it's not easy to rearrange the hospice model of care in this country because it's become embedded in the Medicare hospice benefit, which has become both, an enabler of hospice care, but also kind of a jail for hospice care, preventing it from transforming into the next phase of hospice. So both of those things, it seems to me, create barriers. It's not that it can't be done. We have some programs in New York State where we've trained guardians and guardian agencies and encouraged the empowerment of guardians to make decisions where they refuse certain kinds of care that are non-beneficial without having to go to some, board of overseers and get permission for that. But it has taken 15 years and it still doesn't apply to minorities, it still doesn't apply to people with other kinds of disabilities, because there's this fear that offering less quantity of treatment somehow is going to lead to neglect or lower quality of treatment. So I think we have a long way to go there. It's not an answer, but it's really a kind of explanatory empathy with your question.
Thank you for asking. And I would add to that we've had success locally by partnering with people like Kathy or our ethics committee when there's a question. Should this person get this next procedure? Oh, they've been in the hospital 7 times in the last 7 months. So it's very easy to say yes or no quickly, but it's much better around a table to hear the story of this person's life, what's important to them, and once again, get back to values. Because no matter what your intellectual capacity, you have values. And if you listen carefully to those, listen to their family members, their caregivers who become their family, it works. It just works. And then some people do go into hospice and get that extra measure of care that's so useful.
Hospice has been great working with a lot of our people that I work with.
So it's 8 o'clock. This forum is scheduled to go until 8. We do have a couple more questions, so people who need to leave, feel free. So we'll answer. I have one question here I can answer very quickly, and then one of our panelists has a question. I think she's entitled to ask the question, even though she didn't write it down. This question is foundations that support caregiving at home, where to find them. So when we get our website up and going, they'll all be on vnaandhospice.org. But in Massachusetts, the ASAPS, Aging Services Access Points, Highland Valley Elder Services in Northampton, there's West Mass Elder Care based out of Holyoke, and Greater Springfield Senior Services in Springfield, and Franklin County Home Care up in the Greenfield area. Those all have resources for caregiving at home. They also, if they can't actually support you directly, they can point you in the right direction. VNAs are a great resource. If they can't help you, they certainly will know what community resources you can access in order to get that help. There are also caregiver support groups sponsored by Cooley Dickinson Hospital that you can find online, and you can also, it's in the Daily Hampshire Gazette quite regularly.
Every Tuesday.
Every Tuesday. So, Laurie, what's your question?
Oh, to be brief, okay, so my question, can you hear me? Is just, people always talk about fear of dementia, and okay. Lee was worried about dementia, my father was worried about dementia, that at a certain point, won't be able to make a decision, and you won't be able to have a choice to do what you want to do, end your life the way you want it to end. If you have filled out an end-of-life directive and then you suffer from dementia, does that ensure that you can have things happen the way you want them to? Do you understand my question?
So when you have advanced directives clearly marked, clearly legal, and you're at a point of your life where you have the capacity to make decisions, that's the time to do it. Lock it in. It does give you a lot of protection. How much protection? I think most people that are losing cognitive function, and they realize it, they get pretty worried. And you see pictures in movies, or you visited your uncle in the nursing home, and you just go, boy, that's very scary. I don't want to live like that. So nothing is perfect, but the more you document, the more you tell your family what you want and don't want, the better off you are. What I notice is most people don't get to a point of saying, this is it. Today, I draw the line. I don't want any more treatments. I want to die tomorrow. Mostly it's medicine marches on. So the first time you get your pneumonia, oh, you go to the hospital, you get your antibiotics, oh, you come back, you're weaker. Whatever cognitive ability you had, it's now less also. But if you had clear picture with your family beforehand saying, not only do I not want to have an intubation tube, a breathing tube, or dialysis or whatever, you can see on the form, I don't want any antibiotics do want is comfort medicines. So if you were to write something that specific on your form, and I read it, I'd say, this person really knew what they wanted, and as long as your family's working with you on it, it's likely to happen. If you have a family that's against your wishes, make sure you have a healthcare proxy that's not in your family, somebody who can stand up, take it right in the nose and say, nope, Laurie, you wanted this, I'm going to stick up for you.
Okay, thank you so much everybody for coming out. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Dr. Kirk, for coming up here with us this evening. If we have your email, you'll get more information about our community education programs. And again, thank you for coming out this evening. Drive carefully going home.